It's been a while. I'm sorry. I've been very busy. For those of you who don't know, I'm currently in Japan. I'm in Tokyo, as I'm a full-time missionary at the time. So I'm pretty busy, and I haven't really had time to make a lot of videos. But I have had time to watch the ending of part 6 of the anime, and I thought it was animated quite well. I, of course, already read part 6. I made videos about it before the anime started. And that first video I made ended up not doing well until the anime had started. People started watching the anime, and then the people started wondering, I wonder what a Christian thinks about this, and they looked up the video. And a lot of people, I really liked the comments that I got on that video. It was very interesting to see all of people's thoughts about Pucci, about the show, the story, I should say. And a lot of people had pointed out areas they think that I should have talked about that I didn't. And I really liked, I loved hearing everybody's different points of view and thoughts about it. It really broadened my understanding of part 6 and kind of deepened my appreciation for it. Seeing all the different aspects of the show that I didn't know, that I never really even thought about until people had brought up. And a lot of people wanted me to talk about Pucci's stand and his stand abilities. I barely mentioned them in my first video, and a lot of people thought that was weird, and that his stand abilities are very important to his character, and they're very representative of his ideas. And I think that that's right. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized just how deep it was and how much I could say about his stand abilities. So I want to get into that and talk a little bit about his stand abilities and what I, as a Christian, see in them and in his character. And I think there's some really interesting things to be brought up that I've not heard anyone talk about. My first thought when I was looking at Pucci's stand was I thought about how Pucci really inherited Dio's want to become God. I really like this because it comes in stark contrast to the Joestars and them inheriting the will of their forefathers to fight evil. Pucci inherits the will of Dio to be evil, making him the perfect enemy for Jolene. And I covered in my video on Dio. If you'd like to go watch it, go ahead. I'll briefly summarize my point. Was that Dio is the perfect example of a character who wants to be God, a human being who wants ultimate power and wants to be God. And Dio fails. He's killed. He has immortality. He has incredible power, power over time even, and he still fails. He dies. But Pucci inherits that desire to become God. And the way he does it is interesting and a little complex, and I'll get into that in a minute. But first I want to cover another topic that I should have mentioned in the first video. I don't think I did. Was what exactly is a priest? Pucci is clearly a priest, most likely Catholic. Doesn't say for sure, but I think everyone can agree he's probably a Catholic priest. And I really should have talked a little bit about what a priest is, because that's important. A lot of people, even Christians, think of the word priest as just meaning, as just being another word for holy man or person dedicated to God. But a priest, according to the Bible, is a specific role and function held by a specific person for a specific thing that they need to do. It's not just a generic term for religious leader. A priest in the Old Testament is a person who would intercede for humanity and go to God and ask for the forgiveness of the people. So a Jewish priest would go into the temple or into the inner space by the tabernacle, and they would either deal with the sacrifice, or they could just pray and ask that God would forgive the people of Israel for anything that they had done. And that was the role of the high priest anyway. And there were lots of priests. All of them had the role to intercede between man and God, be like the middleman. But the high priest was the one who would deal with the really important stuff. The high priest every so often would go into the Holy of Holies and ask for God to forgive all of Israel, even the people who had strayed super far from God. And that's what a priest is. That's what a priest does. The Catholic Church still holds on that tradition of having priests. I'm not Catholic. I don't believe that the role of priest needs to be fulfilled anymore. I think that Jesus is the ultimate high priest. He sealed the deal for us, and we don't need priests anymore. That's why in my tradition and in other traditions we have pastors, which are different than priests. Pastors don't believe that they have the role to intercede between man and God. But Pucci, being of a more liturgical background with being a priest, he would fit that background of believing that he is somebody who intercedes between man and God, that he's supposed to go to God on behalf of the people. Now, I covered in my first video that Pucci doesn't seem to hold many Christian beliefs at all, and that's kind of sus, but we can be certain that he went to some sort of Catholic seminary, some sort of school, and he would have at least heard some kind of theology. He would have been aware of some of it, even if he didn't fully accept it or if it had been tainted by Dio. So Pucci, at some point, would have at least heard that he, as a priest, is somebody who intercedes for the people to God. And once he starts viewing Dio as God in his life, as he idolizes Dio, that idea of a priest really kind of takes hold of his life, I feel like. You can really see Pucci. Well, Pucci has a special relationship with Dio that nobody else has in the story, just like how priests would have special relationships with God in the Old Testament. So how does that idea necessarily translate into Whitesnake, his original stand ability, Pucci's ability? I had some people mention that Whitesnake was like the opposite of a priest. Whitesnake steals memories and souls, where priests are not supposed to do that, and I don't think that's exactly right. I think that fails to really understand what a priest is. A priest doesn't give anybody souls. They don't save souls. Only Jesus does that. So Whitesnake isn't really the opposite of a priest. Whitesnake's abilities involve taking people's memories and souls in the form of like stand abilities, and they come out as discs. We also see Whitesnake at the start of part 6 turning into a goo and creating illusions and making people see things that aren't real, which ended up kind of being not used a lot in part 6, but I think is a really thematic ability for Pucci, a supposed holy man who doesn't really believe in anything that he says, and to the public anyway, is somebody who can fabricate fake illusions and trick people. I mean, that because Pucci is in a sense a con man. He works at the prison and puts on this facade of this priest who cares about people, but in reality he's only in it so that he can try and revive Dio or move forward with Dio's plan. And as far as the stealing souls and memories part of it, I think that has more to do with Pucci trying to be God. God has the ability to give and take souls from Earth. God has the ability to reside over your memories. Pucci, as he inherits the will to become God, which I'll talk more about in a minute, he wants to control people's spirits and their minds like God can. Now, before anyone types it, I do know that the manga specifically points out that Pucci's stand ability comes from his desire to keep his sister around. When his sister dies, he wants to keep the memory and soul of his sister around even though she's dead, and that's where his stand ability comes from. But I think that's not the full truth, because his stand doesn't just work on his sister, it works on everybody. So I think that when Pucci, his desire to want to keep his sister around even though she's gone, develops over time into this want to just control people's spirits, their memories, and their lives. And that slowly develops, thanks to Dio, into a will to be God. An interesting point about the stands that I'll point out little by little as I go through is that Whitesnake and Seamoon are both covered in letters, if you look closely. And those letters are ACGT, I think it is, which are for genetic material. I'm not a scientist, obviously, and it's been a while since I learned about alleles and adenines in middle school, but it's genetic material, and that's important, and I'll get back to it later. So let's talk for a minute about why I think that Dio wants to be God. And it all stems from Dio. Dio 100% wants to be God. I think that's so important to his character. He wants to be the most powerful. He wants to control people's lives. And that all stems from the fact that his childhood was awful and he felt like he had no control over anything. This happens in real life to real people when during a person's childhood, if they, for whatever reason, feel like they have no control over anything, they can grow up to be manipulative and want to control everything, to regain the feeling that they didn't have or lost when they were a child. Dio is sort of the extreme in this regard. Pucci, he also had bad events happen in his life. He wasn't a child necessarily. I think he was a late teenager, so I guess it's a child, but to some people it is. But Pucci, of course, we talked about it in that first video. His sister dies, and he's forced to wipe the memory of his brother, his long-lost brother, that he didn't know was even alive, and a lot of horrible things happened to him. And I can only imagine how he must have felt in feeling completely out of control in that situation. The reason that all happened, which Pucci doesn't really seem to get, is that all those bad things happened because he tried to control the situation, and he failed to do so. And I think that slowly developed over the course of his life into wanting to succeed in controlling people's lives. And when he sparks this desire to keep people's souls with him and keep their memories around even if they die, combined with his want to control things that he can't control, I think that's what develops Whitesnake into the ability that it is, and his personality too. And it's interesting if you think about, I really like that moment in the manga. Jolene and Hermes find the tire and it's full of discs guarded by Foo Fighters. I think that's interesting because it shows that even with the Whitesnake ability, Pucci is already trying to be God before he's even evolved a stand. Pucci's collecting tons of souls and memories and keeping them with him, even if the people whose memories they belong to have died. This, in a sense, turns Whitesnake into heaven in a way, which is interesting, considering what the stand evolves into. If Whitesnake keeps and holds on to souls and memories, even if the person is dead, that's kind of like a heaven, or at least an afterlife. I guess it's not really a paradise, so maybe not a heaven, but it's like an afterlife that Pucci is in control of, which certainly feeds into a god complex that I think quickly develops throughout part 6. Now here's where things get really interesting, when Seamoon comes out. And I was watching the anime this past December, and a lot of things started to flood into my mind as I was watching Seamoon be animated, which was great. The scene looked much better. It got a little confusing for me in the manga, to be honest. Seeing it animated helped a lot. I find it interesting that Seamoon's abilities are essentially to control gravity, which means a lot in the JoJo universe. Keep in mind that in JoJo, according to Dio, gravity is just another way of saying fate. That gravity is fate. When fate brings people together, it's like gravity. They're just brought together by this external force that they can't control and that they can't fight against. Pucci controlling gravity, to him, in a sense, is like controlling fate. He even starts developing some time control abilities. He can invert people's body parts and make them decompose. That's a little confusing. And we'll talk more about that in the next evolution of his stand. But what I think is really interesting is when it comes to his gravity control, Pucci specifically states that the center of gravity is beneath his feet. We see at one point Pucci running around a building, and he'll stand up on the ceiling to make gravity shift up, and then he'll jump down and gravity will switch back down. And so Pucci himself is the center of gravity, but the gravity specifically is underneath his feet. It just so happens that in the Bible, in Isaiah 66, God specifically says that the earth is under his feet. It's his footstool, which is, of course, metaphorical. Ties in actually surprisingly well. So well that I wonder if that was intentional. I feel like it maybe had to have been, but maybe it's just a happy coincidence. Because Simun's ability, since Pucci is the center of gravity, and everything is pulled towards gravity, and gravity's underneath his feet, this essentially puts all of Earth under Pucci's feet, makes Earth his footstool. Pucci's ability extends a little bit more than that. He can touch something and change its gravity to make it apart from the rest of the gravity, the normal gravity. It's complicated. You can watch it and read it, and it's still a little complicated, but essentially, Pucci gets to control gravity and controls a little bit of time during the short time that he has Simun. This, I think, reminds me a little bit of how God, we're told in the Bible, holds everything together. He is the cornerstone from which the laws of physics even function. Gravity can only work if God is making it work. Gravity can't work apart from God. He created it and he sustains it. Now, I'm not saying that gravity only makes sense if God exists. I'm saying that if we do believe that God exists, then we have to believe that the laws of physics cannot function without him, that he holds the universe together. In a sense, God is creating and controlling gravity at all times. Similarly to how Pucci begins to tap into the power of controlling gravity as Simun. Interestingly enough, Pucci's power seems to only extend to Earth and maybe its ozone layer, as far out as that, because we don't see every star in the universe hurtling towards the planet. Maybe that's happening and they're just so far away it doesn't happen before Pucci dies. But it seems like his power of gravity only extends to Earth. So maybe he's not as powerful as he thinks he is. Finally, his stand develops into Made in Heaven. There's a lot to get into with even that name, Made in Heaven. And it sounds more like the descriptor of an angel more so than a god. And we'll get into that more in a second. But at this point, Pucci has full control over time. He can accelerate time super fast to the point where he can reset the universe. This is based on the idea that eventually the universe will cease to be and will shrivel back into a tiny spot, and where the energy will build up and the Big Bang will happen a second time. And I don't know, from what I understand, again, I'm not an astrophysicist, but from what I understand, this isn't necessarily scientific consensus. It's just a theory it's a hypothesis that's been thrown out there. But assumedly that this would happen, Pucci accelerates time until that happens, and the universe is reset. Interestingly enough, instead of a new universe being created, it's the same universe as before, but it's more like a different timeline that's slightly altered. So I see this as being reminiscent of his time control and less of sort of a space control sort of ability. Pucci can create a whole new universe, but it ends up only being a separate timeline since he controls time and not material objects in space. It's also at this point where his stand stops being covered in the genetic symbols. Both Simun and Whitesnake had the GACT symbols, and I think it's very important that when he reaches Made in Heaven, he loses the symbols because he's no longer bound by nature. His past two abilities were still bound by this sort of genetic mortal frame, and once he hits Made in Heaven, he really ascends into what he believes anyway to be a god. And as a reflection of his spirit, his stand not being covered in the genetic material shows that Pucci really believes that he is an ascendant god at this point. At this point, Pucci has control over time, he has control over gravity, fate, he has control over everybody's lives in a sense. He knows everyone's future, and they know too, but he's the only one with power to do anything about it. He's the only one with great power anyway, I should say. At this point, Pucci seems to have quite a lot of abilities. He even has the most powerful ability that a god could even have, and that's to create. He in a sense, by restarting the universe, creates a new universe. And in a sense, he doesn't really create it. He just speeds up the time, and what was going to happen happened. And in a sense, he doesn't have control over what happens. He just makes it happen sooner and faster. But he had to have some creative hand in the creation of the universal reset, because everybody in the new universe can see their own future, which most likely would not have happened unless Pucci's stand ability had interfered with the time that this is all happening in. Pucci did something to alter and create new things within this semi-new universe. And creation is, I feel like that's one of the ultimate abilities of God, creation. It's something that humans can't really do, not in the same way that God can. God can create things from nothing, in a sense. He can just snap his fingers and boom, there's land, there's breathing animals and stars. Humans can't do that. We can craft things out of mud, but that's not the same. I almost forgot to mention that the stand ability name, Made in Heaven, is an interesting name. The name is evocative of more of an angel than a god. God wasn't ever made. He's always existed, but the angels were made, and they were made in heaven, seemingly. And what's interesting about angels is they are kind of perfect, but not in the same way Jesus is. They exist without sin, but they can sin, and some have and have fallen, like the famous example of Satan. And I think that plays a little bit into why his stand is named that way. He's not God. He's like a cheap imitation of a god. He's got the ability of a god, the sinless attributes, like an angel has a sinless attributes. Pucci doesn't. He's got the abilities of God, so to speak, but he doesn't have the being of God, and so he's not God. Similarly to how an angel possesses many of the status symbols of a god, so to speak, in being a perfect spiritual being, but isn't a godly being. It's just an angel. And Pucci, likewise, as powerful as he is, he was still a created being, and as such can never be a creator type of being. To have that make more sense, I see Pucci as being more of like a fallen angel than a god. He's somebody who has lots of power and thinks he should have more, but can't and fails to do so, and is struck down by God's plan, I suppose. Pucci's stand ability may have been some sort of spiritual made in heaven ability, but even something like that doesn't make you a god, because as amazing as angels are, they're not gods. They're just angels. But at this point, Pucci finally starts to realize that it's not abilities that create a god. It's being that creates a god. A god is not defined by what he can do, but by who he is. This is why, and I mentioned this a little bit in my video on Dio, this is why a human can never be God. Because we're human. Because humans are by definition not God. And God, by definition, has always been God. So how can Jesus be both God and man at the same time? Well, it's because he was God first. Even though Pucci has all of these abilities, he's still killed by a child. A cool child that we like, but a child. And God, as far as the Trinity goes, can't be killed by a child, no matter how hard that child tries or however many stand abilities that child might have. So what's the lesson to be derived from all of that? I think it's that we shouldn't try to play God. We shouldn't try to be God. We shouldn't try to be something that we're not. In Pucci's new universe, everybody gets to see the future, and he describes this as being good. He thinks that this way people will be joyful and content, that they know what's going to happen, and they never have to fear or worry or wonder. They know what's going to happen, and they can be good and content. But who is Pucci to decide that for them? Maybe there are people out there who would be content if they knew their future. But Pucci doesn't get to decide their fates for them. Pucci doesn't get to just give them those abilities. God is in control of people's lives. Pucci's not, and shouldn't be. Pucci didn't ask every human on the earth for their consent before he sped the universe into a reset. Pucci thought he just had that power. He thought he could just control people. Pucci just wanted to control people. He wanted to have power. He wanted to know the future. He wanted to see what was coming. But knowing what's coming is different than being able to change what's coming. If Pucci was a child and knew what was going to happen to his sister and his brother, that doesn't mean he would have been able to do anything about it. And it doesn't mean he would have felt any better after it happened. We can argue all day about whether fate is real or not, but one thing is for sure. Humans aren't meant to control it. If fate is real, then God is the only one who's qualified to control it. And just a reminder to anyone out there who might be thinking of trying to become God, you could have all the abilities and powers that any fantasy book has ever written about, but you still might get killed by a child, and you still won't be God. Stay hydrated, folks. Sorry for the long wait in getting a new video. I have been busy. I'm sorry. There's so many videos I want to make, but I just don't have time. I'm rewatching JoJo's. I'm in part 2 right now. Rewatching all of it in preparation of the start of part 9, which I'm very excited about. I had the thought the other day, what if I did a monthly review of the chapters when they came out, a sort of a Christian review of each chapter. Let me know if you'd be interested in that. I don't have to do it if there's not really much interest in it. There's a lot of people out there who are going to be doing monthly reviews of the chapters. Some people, I'm sure, would be doing much better jobs than I would be doing. But if you're interested in hearing a Christian review every month when the new chapter comes out and spending that hype time with me, then let me know. And that's something that I can definitely commit to doing. And if you have any video ideas you'd like to see me talk about, anime you'd like me to watch, let me know in the comments below. And I will try to make a video before next year. Until then, I'll see you guys later.